At 10:45 hours on October 18, 1943, British infantry soldiers crouched in the rubble of Calvi Vecchia, Italy, watching the sky and knowing they were running out of time. The village was theirs. The 169th London Infantry Brigade, commanded by Brigadier Lewis, line had pushed through German defensive positions faster than anyone expected. They'd captured the town ahead of schedule. The Germans had retreated, leaving only scattered resistance. The British troops of the 56th London Infantry Division held every street, every building, every defensive position. But nobody back at headquarters knew they were there. All attempts to contact Allied command by radio and other means of communication had failed. The wire lines had been cut by retreating Germans. The portable radios couldn't get signals through the mountainous Italian terrain. Messenger runners couldn't make it back through German-held territory without being killed or captured. The British were completely isolated. And 20 miles away, at the 12th Air Support Command airfield, American bomber crews were preparing to reduce Calvi Vecchia to smoking rubble. The bombing run had been scheduled earlier. Intelligence reported that Calvi Vecchia was a fortified German strongpoint anchoring their defensive line across central Italy. The plan called for American bombers to hit the village that morning to soften German defenses before the British infantry assault. Except the British attacked ahead of schedule and succeeded, and now they were sitting in a village that American bombs were about to destroy. The commanders knew what American heavy bombers could do to a fortified position. Concentrated bombing turned stone buildings into killing zones of shattered masonry and flying debris. The blast waves alone could collapse lungs. Secondary explosions from ammunition stores and fuel dumps created firestorms. If those bombers arrived on schedule, everyone in Calvi Vecchia would die. British soldiers and Italian civilians both. The village still had civilians hiding in cellars who hadn't evacuated because the fighting had moved too quickly. The number at risk was staggering. Official estimates ranged from at least 100 Allied soldiers to possibly 1,000 when including Italian civilians. General Mark Clark, commander of the U.S. Fifth Army, later estimated that at least 1,000 lives were saved that morning. There was one option left: the Pigeon Service. The United States Army Signal Corps Pigeon Service had been operating in Italy since the invasion began in September 1943. Small units of specialists, called pigeoneers, managed mobile lofts that traveled with advancing forces. The pigeons provided emergency communication when radios failed, which happened constantly in the Italian mountains. Over 90% of Army messages sent by pigeons were received successfully during World War II. Faster than runners, more reliable than radios in mountainous terrain, impossible to jam or intercept. The British unit had been assigned pigeons from the American Pigeon Loft at British 10th Corps headquarters. The birds were kept in portable cages carried by Signals personnel. A Signals soldier prepared to send the emergency message. He pulled the small aluminum message capsule from his equipment pouch. The message was written: brief, clear, urgent. British 169 Brigade captured Calvi Vecchia 10:45 hours. Cancel airstrike. Repeat, cancel airstrike. Village secured. The paper was rolled tight, slid into the capsule, ready to send. The soldier opened the pigeon cage. Inside was an American pigeon, a blue check cock with a white splash pattern. The bird's tag read US 43SC6390. The soldiers called him G.I. Joe. The American pigeons were trained using techniques developed at Fort Monmouth in New Jersey over 2 decades. They could fly over water, through smoke in bad weather. This particular bird had been hatched on March 24, 1943, at the American Pigeon Breeding Facility in Algiers, North Africa. His parents had been brought from the United States by members of the 6681 Signal Pigeon Company. G.I. Joe had undergone training for two-way homing pigeons, then deployed to the Tunisian front in May 1943. After the Tunisian campaign ended, he was moved to Bizerte, Tunisia, and finally to the Italian front on October 6, 1943. Just 12 days before this mission, the soldier attached the message capsule to G.I. Joe's left leg. The capsule was lightweight aluminum, waterproof, designed to stay attached even if the bird was injured. He carried the pigeon outside into the bright Italian morning. The sky was clear. Good flying weather. He could hear the distant rumble of aircraft engines somewhere to the north. The bombers were warming up. The soldier held G.I. Joe for a moment, then released him into the air. The pigeon launched upward, circled once to get his bearings, then turned north toward the 10th Corps headquarters. G.I. Joe disappeared into the sky. The time was approximately 10:47 hours. What happened in the next 20 minutes would save hundreds of lives. To understand why a pigeon became the last hope for British soldiers that morning, you need to understand what was happening in Italy in October 1943. The Allied invasion of mainland Italy had begun exactly 6 weeks earlier on September 9th, with amphibious landings at Salerno. The 56th London Division had landed as part of British 10th Corps, fighting their way ashore under heavy German fire. The first weeks were brutal. German Field Marshal Albert Kesselring had convinced Adolf Hitler that defending Italy as far south as possible would tie down Allied forces and delay any invasion of Germany. Kesselring built a series of defensive lines across the Italian peninsula. Each line was positioned to take maximum advantage of Italy's mountainous terrain. Rivers, ridges, and mountains became fortified barriers manned by German troops who knew how to make every Allied advance cost blood. The Volturno Line was the first major defensive position the Allies faced after capturing Naples on October 1st. The line ran from the Adriatic coast through the central mountain ranges to the Volturno River on the west coast. German forces had weeks to prepare positions, lay mines, demolish bridges, and fortify towns. The Hermann Göring Panzer Division held 16 miles of front from Grazenais to Chiasso. The 15th Panzer Grenadier Division defended 12 miles of coastal sector. Both divisions were veteran units filled with experienced soldiers who understood defensive warfare. They fought delaying actions, inflicted maximum casualties on advanced Allied forces, then withdrew to the next prepared position. Allied commanders described the German tactics as systematic and professional. Every village became a strong point. Every river crossing became a killing zone. Every road was mined and covered by artillery. The terrain favored defenders heavily. A fat coastal plain gave way to ridges rising 2,500 feet above the Volturno River. The ridges ran parallel to Highway 6, the main route north toward Rome. German observers on the high ground could see every Allied movement and direct artillery fire with devastating accuracy. Weather complicated operations. October in central Italy meant temperatures between 12 and 22 degrees Celsius, frequent rain that swelled rivers and turned roads to mud. British soldiers who waded across the Volturno described cold, swift water that came up to their chests. Equipment got soaked. Radios stopped working. Communications broke down. The mud slowed everything. Trucks bogged down. Artillery pieces sank into the ground. Supplies couldn't move forward. A Soviet general observed Italian conditions and remarked that the Soviet Union wasn't the only place with mud and blood. By late December, winter blizzards would halt offensive operations completely. The 56th Division sector included Calvi Vecchia, a small village positioned on a lesser ridge about 10 miles from the Volturno. The ridge branched at right angles from the main mountain range, crossing Highway 6 and ending near Frankelize on Highway 7. Capturing Calvi Vecchia would open a gap in German defenses and allow Allied forces to advance toward the Barbara Line, the next German defensive position 10 to 20 miles to the north. But German troops weren't giving up Calvi Vecchia easily. They'd fortified the village with machine gun positions, dug fighting positions into the hillsides, zeroed artillery on approach routes. Intelligence estimated German strength at Company Lel, reinforced with armor support. The planned Allied operation called for American bombers to hit Calvi Vecchia in the morning to destroy German fortifications, followed by a British infantry assault to capture the ruins. Standard procedure for dealing with fortified positions. Bomb it flat. Then send in infantry to mop up survivors. The bombing was scheduled for that morning. The British infantry assault was supposed to follow in the afternoon, except Brigadier Lewis Line saw an opportunity. German forces in his sector seemed weaker than intelligence estimated. Patrols reported fewer troops, less activity, signs that Germans might be preparing to withdraw. Line had a reputation as an aggressive commander. He'd taken command of the 169th Brigade back in March 1942, led them through operations in the Middle East, brought them to Italy in September. He was 44 years old, a professional soldier who'd graduated from the Royal Military College at Sandhurst back in 1919. Line had a distinguished service order for his Middle East service. He'd also just finished a 5-day period commanding the entire 56th Division. The division commander recovered from injuries sustained during the Volturno crossing. Line knew his troops knew their capabilities, knew when to take calculated risks. On the morning of October 18th, he decided to attack Calvi Vecchia immediately instead of waiting for the bombers. The assault went better than expected. The 2 5th Battalion Queen's Royal Regiment pushed into the village from the south. The 2 6th Battalion came in from the east. The 2 7th Battalion provided support and secured flanks. German resistance was lighter than anticipated. The defenders fired some machine gun bursts, lobbed a few mortar rounds, then withdrew. By 10:45 hours, less than 2 hours after the attack began, British forces controlled Calvi Vecchia. Lyne's gamble had paid off. But now they had a different problem. Nobody at higher headquarters knew the British had captured the village, and American bombers were fueled, armed, and preparing to destroy it. The radio situation was typical for Italy in 1943. The SCR 300 backpack radio was supposed to be the solution to infantry communication problem, developed at Fort Monmouth starting in 1940. The SCR 300 was a technological achievement. 18 vacuum tubes, frequency modulation, 40 to 48 MHz range, 41 channels. 300 milliwatts of carrier output gave the radio a range of 3 miles under ideal conditions. Prototypes had achieved 8-mile ranges. The entire unit weighed 38 pounds with a BA-70 battery, or 32 pounds with a lighter BA-80 battery. One soldier carried the radio, another carried spare batteries and the hand microphone. The SCR 300 represented cutting-edge communications technology for 1943, but the SCR 300 had significant limitations. Batteries lasted 20 to 25 hours with the BA-70 or 12 to 15 hours with the lighter BA-80. In combat conditions, batteries died faster because radios stayed on constantly. Replacing batteries in the field was difficult. The Army treated battery resupply as high priority, equivalent to ammunition and ration. Even with adequate battery supply, the radios often failed. The 5HF frequency range used line-of-sight propagation. Radio waves at 40 to 48 MHz traveled in straight lines. Any obstruction between transmitting and receiving antennas caused signal loss. Hills blocked signals. Mountains blocked signals. Even large buildings blocked signals. Italy's mountainous terrain created constant communication problems. Signal teams attached to combat units reported that terrain often interrupted communications with headquarters. Radio operators described situations where moving 50 meters to the left or right meant the difference between clear communication and complete silence. The mountains created dead zones where radios simply didn't work. Physical challenges made things worse. Carrying 38 pounds of radio equipment while under fire was exhausting. The antenna attracted enemy fire. Radio operators quickly learned that the tall antenna made them priority targets for German snipers. Getting hit while wearing the radio meant 38 pounds of equipment slamming into your back. The radios were reasonably durable but not indestructible. Vacuum tubes broke, connections loosened. Water got into electronics. Battle damage destroyed components. Maintenance required trained technicians and spare parts that weren't always available at the front. Units operating in forward positions often found their radios useless precisely when they needed them most. At Calvi Vecchia, the radios failed, whether from dead batteries, terrain interference, damaged equipment, or some combination of factors. British signals personnel couldn't raise 10th Corps headquarters. They tried different frequencies, moved to higher ground, checked connections, did everything their training prescribed. Nothing worked. Wire communications were out because retreating Germans had cut the line. Messenger runners couldn't get through because German forces still held the territory between Calvi Vecchia and Allied line. The British were isolated in enemy territory, with American bombers preparing to kill them. The Pigeon became their last option, not their preferred option, not their backup option. Their last option when everything else had failed. The Pigeon Service that made this mission possible had been built over decades. The United States Army had experimented with pigeons since the punitive expedition against Pancho Villa in 1916. The experiments failed. The birds weren't properly trained, the handlers didn't understand pigeon behavior, and the Army lost interest. But when America entered World War I in 1917, General John Pershing saw French and British pigeon services operating in France. The French had been using pigeons since the Franco-Prussian War. Their birds delivered messages through conditions that destroyed wire communications and made runners suicide missions. Pershing requested that pigeon specialists be commissioned into the U.S. Army. In November 1917, the Signal Corps Pigeon Service received official authorization. By the end of World War I, the Signal Corps had sent more than 50,000 trained pigeons to the American Expeditionary Forces. The success of homing pigeons in war prompted the Army to keep the service after the armistice. The chief signal officer established the Signal Corps Pigeon Breeding and Training section at Camp Alfred Vale, New Jersey, which was later renamed Fort Monmouth. The officer in charge of the British Pigeon Service supplied 150 pairs of breeding pigeons to the U.S. Army. They arrived at Camp Vale without loss in October 1919. At Fort Monmouth, pigeon experts devoted years to improving training, breeding, and equipment. Colonel Clifford Pouter took command of the pigeon program in 1936 and revolutionized training methods. Pouter rejected the World War I approach of training by starvation and replaced it with kindness-based methods that dramatically improved performance. By the outbreak of World War II, Fort Monmouth pigeoneers had perfected techniques for training two-way pigeons. Normal pigeon training was one way: release the bird anywhere, it flies home. But two-way training meant birds could fly from point A to point B and back to point A. That required training the bird to recognize two different home lofts. Complicated training, high failure rate, but the birds that succeeded were incredibly valuable. Fort Monmouth also developed techniques for flying pigeons over water. Most pigeons refused to fly over large bodies of water because they navigated using landmarks. The trainers used incremental training, starting with short flights over narrow rivers, gradually increasing distance and water coverage. By 1943, American trained pigeons could fly 50 miles over open ocean. The trainers even developed night flight training between 1928 and 1930. Training nocturnal navigation was extraordinarily difficult because pigeons are daytime birds, but Fort Monmouth succeeded in producing birds capable of night missions. The standard training cycle took 8 weeks. The first 4 weeks, chicks stayed in the nest. At week 4, handlers removed the chick and placed it in a mobile loft. For the next 3 weeks, the loft moved daily while the bird flew short missions, morning, noon, and evening, to memorize aerial bearings and landmarks. By week 8, the bird could fly 50 to 60 miles when stamina was sufficient. Progressive extension continued until birds achieved combat readiness. Motivational techniques included food withholding until return, which created strong incentive to complete missions quickly. The jealousy method involved introducing another male near the bird's mate before release. His return was guaranteed to be faster because he wanted to protect his territory. Sex drive proved the most effective motivator for male pigeons. Female pigeons were motivated by nesting instinct and protection of eggs. When World War II began, the Army activated 12 signal pigeon companies. The 277th, 278th, 282nd, 284th, and 285th deployed to Europe. The 279th went to the Pacific. The 280th split, with 1 platoon in Europe and the main unit in the China-Burma-India theater. Each company included approximately 3,000 pigeons at full strength. The total pigeon force for World War II reached 54,000 birds, with 36,000 deployed overseas. Personnel included 150 officers and 3,000 enlisted men. That represented 1/3 of 1% of the entire Army Signal Corps, a tiny specialized branch operating in the shadow of radio and telephone communications. But the pigeon service delivered results. Pigeons sent approximately 30,000 messages overseas during World War II. Success rate was between 90 and 96% depending on which source you consult. Less than 1% of messages required encoding, because pigeons were so reliable that security wasn't a major concern. If a bird got shot down, the enemy recovered one brief tactical message, not enough intelligence value to justify the encryption overhead. Compare that to radio communications, where every transmission risked interception and required encoding. The simplicity of pigeon communications was a feature, not a bug. Write message, attach to bird, release bird, bird delivers message. No batteries, no frequency coordination, no line of sight requirements, no vulnerability to jamming or interception beyond shooting the bird out of the sky. Mobile lofts traveled with forward units in quarter-ton trailers, usually towed by jeeps. Larger trailer lofts served air bases and less mobile operation. Lofts needed exposure to sunlight, dry conditions, good ventilation, and excellent sanitation. When pigeons returned from missions, A wire triggered a bell or buzzer to alert handlers that a message had arrived. The 277th Signal Pigeon Company in France managed 3,500 pigeons in August 1944, requiring construction of open eyries to augment regular facilities. The 1306th Signal Pigeon Company Aviation maintained monthly strength averaging 3,317 pigeons. Feeding was critical. Balanced nutrition determined homing proficiency. The Signal Corps procured feed in the zone of interior and shipped it overseas. Early shipments used burlap bags that deteriorated, suffered rodent damage, and grew mold. Later shipments used hermetically sealed tin containers after fumigation. The Navy's feed composition was 50% Canada peas, 25% Argentine corn, 15% Kaffir corn or Milo maize, and 10% whole rice. The Army authorized 45,000 multivitamin capsules per pigeon company quarterly. In Africa, Lieutenant Charles Costa noted that if there was 1 cup of water available, the birds drank before the men. That wasn't sentimentality. Dead pigeons meant no communications. Dehydrated pigeons couldn't fly missions. Keeping birds alive and healthy was operationally essential. Veterinary services became official in April 1941 when First Lieutenant C.I. Angstrom of the Veterinary Corps was ordered to active duty at Fort Monmouth. By spring 1942, Signal Pigeon Companies were authorized organic veterinary detachments, consisting of 1 Veterinary Corps officer plus 1 enlisted technician. At least 17 Veterinary Corps officers served with pigeon organizations during World War II. Common diseases included pigeon pox, controlled by annual prophylactic vaccination. Salmonellosis was the leading cause of mortality and caused permanent disabilities like lameness and wing droop. The 280th Signal Pigeon Company lost 200 pigeons in 7 months to salmonellosis. Trichomoniasis required 4-week treatment. Hemoproteus, pigeon malaria, appeared in units deployed to Hawaii. The 6681 Signal Pigeon Company that bred G.I. Joe was a provisional unit operating in North Africa and Italy. Staff Sergeant Robert Steinhaus from Merrill, Wisconsin, and Technician 5th Grade Elroy Rausch from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, supervised G.I. Joe during his service in Italy. First Lieutenant Winton Prater commanded the company and wrote the official report requesting press release about G.I. Joe's mission. These were the pigeoneers who maintained the lofts, trained the birds, handled the logistics, kept the communication system functioning. Specialized soldiers doing unglamorous work that saved lives when high technology failed. G.I. Joe flew 20 miles in 20 minutes that morning. Average speed was 60 miles per hour, which was good performance but not exceptional. Racing pigeons routinely reached 60 to 70 miles per hour. Champion racers with favorable tailwinds could hit 90 to 100 miles per hour. The world record non-stop flight was 752 miles in 36 hours. Continuous flight recorded in Africa in 1861. World War II pigeons routinely flew 400 miles through selective breeding improvements over World War I birds. Some exceptional birds could manage 600 miles. Distance capability wasn't the issue. The issue was speed and reliability over tactical distances. 20 miles in 20 minutes was exactly what the mission required. Not a record-breaking performance, just a solid professional flight by a well-trained bird doing the job he was trained to do. G.I. Joe navigated using multiple systems that scientists in 1943 didn't fully understand. Contemporary researchers knew pigeons used solar navigation and visual landmarks, but the full scope of avian navigation remained mysterious. Modern research has shown that pigeons detect magnetic fields, use olfactory map, sense infrasound, and integrate multiple navigation systems simultaneously. In 1943, pigeoneers just knew the birds worked. Release them anywhere, they flew home. The biological mechanisms were black box, but the operational results were consistent. G.I. Joe arrived at 12th Air Support Command headquarters at approximately 11:07 hours, 20 minutes after release, exactly as expected. The message cylinder was removed from his leg and delivered to the command post. Officers read the message. British 169 Brigade captured Calvi Vecchia, 10:45 hours, cancel airstrike. Repeat, cancel airstrike. Village secured. The bombers were preparing to take off. Crews were in their aircraft running final checks. If the message had arrived 5 minutes later, The bombers might already have been airborne and unable to be recalled. The bombing mission was cancelled immediately. The British troops in Calvi Vecchia never knew how close they came to being killed by their own air force. G.I. Joe had delivered the message with minutes to spare. The military report filed by Lieutenant Prater was preserved in British National Archives file TNWO 204/2930. The report stated that G.I. Joe probably saved the lives of at least 100 Allied soldiers. General Mark Clark estimated at least 1,000 when including Italian civilians still in the village. The discrepancy between estimates reflects uncertainty about civilian casualties. The conservative verified number was over 100 soldiers. The broader estimate, including civilians, reached 1,000. Either way, G.I. Joe prevented a massacre. British soldiers who'd fought their way into Calvi Vecchia against German defenses would have been killed by American bombs. Italian civilians who'd survived German occupation would have died in the rubble. All because communication systems failed, and nobody at headquarters knew the village had been captured ahead of schedule. This wasn't the only incident where pigeons prevented friendly fire. At Monte Cassino in early 1944, a company of Nepali Gurkhas and British troops were trapped on Hangman's Hill for 9 days with no means of communication. Radio didn't work due to terrain and proximity to enemy lines. 3 British volunteers carried American homing pigeons in haversacks through German lines. The pigeons delivered messages identifying safe escape routes and saved the surrounded troops. In Burma, a pigeon named Jungle Joe was dropped by parachute behind Japanese lines with a radio operator. When the operator was lost during the jump, Jungle Joe spent 7 days confined in a 40 by 4 by 4 inch bamboo jump container while a patrol gathered intelligence. Then Jungle Joe flew 225 miles over the highest mountains in Burma, carrying information that opened a large section of Burma to Allied occupation. Jungle Joe was only 4 months old. In France, pigeons flew missions for the 277th Signal Pigeon Company, supporting the advance through Normandy and into Germany. Every combat theater had multiple documented incidents of pigeons delivering messages when radios failed and saving lives as a result. The most famous pigeon from World War I was Cher. On October 4, 1918, during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, Major Charles Whittlesey's lost battalion was trapped behind German lines in the Argonne forest, under friendly fire from American artillery. Previous pigeons had been shot down. Cher was the last bird available. The message read, "We are along the road parallel to 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." Cher flew 25 miles in approximately 25 to 30 minutes to Mobile Loft No. 11 at Rampont. German fire shot through his breast, blinded one eye, nearly severed his leg. The message capsule was hanging by a single tendon. Cher delivered the message and saved 194 survivors of the lost battalion. He was awarded the French Croix de Guerre with palm oak leaf cluster. He died June 13, 1919. At Fort Monmouth from his wounds. His mounted remains are displayed at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. Recent research by Smithsonian historian Dr. Frank Blazich suggests some detail may have been embellished for wartime propaganda, but the core story is verified. President Wilson was another World War I hero pigeon. Initially assigned to the U.S. Army Tank Corps under Colonel George Patton at the Battle of St. Mihiel, President Wilson later supported the 78th Division near Grand Pré, France. On October 5, 1918, President Wilson delivered a message from a tank turret with locations of enemy machine gun nests. He flew 25 miles to Rampont Loft in 25 minutes through heavy German fire. His left leg was shot away, and he had a gaping wound in his breast. President Wilson died in 1929 and was taxidermied at the Smithsonian Institution. Blackie Harrington served at Guadalcanal in the Pacific Theater with the 164th Infantry Division. Blackie flew a message detailing positions of 300 Japanese troops, was hit by shrapnel, fell into a thicket, took off again with part of his neck and chest blown away. When given water, it dribbled out of his chest wound. Blackie required numerous stitches but survived, and received a medal from Major General Alexander Patch. He spent his remaining days breeding with a female pigeon named Madame Murphy. G.I. Joe's performance at Calvi Vecchia earned him recognition as the most outstanding flight by a U.S. Army pigeon in World War II. After the war ended, G.I. Joe was retired to the Churchill Loft at Fort Monmouth in June 1946. The Churchill Loft served as the Army's Hall of Fame for homing pigeons, housing decorate hero birds from both world wars alongside 24 other distinguished pigeons. On November 4, 1946, G.I. Joe received the PDSA Dickin Medal at a ceremony held at the Tower of London. The medal was presented by Major General Charles Cately, who later became General Sir Charles Cately, and served as Governor of Gibraltar from 1958 to 1962. The Lord Mayor of London was also present. G.I. Joe was the 29th recipient of the Dickin Medal and the first non-British recipient ever. He remained the only American recipient for 55 years. The PDSA Dickin Medal was established in 1943 by Maria Dickin, founder of the People's Dispensary for Sick Animals. The medal is a bronze medallion bearing the inscription for gallantry, and we also serve. It's commonly called the Animal's Victoria Cross. The first awards were made on December 2nd, 1943, to 3 RAF pigeons named Winky, White Vision, and Tyke. Between 1943 and 1949, 54 animals received the Dickin Medal. 32 were pigeons, 18 were dogs, 3 were horses. 1 was a cat. Winky helped locate a downed RAF bomber crew in the North Sea. White Vision flew 60 miles in heavy weather from a ditched aircraft. Paddy recorded the fastest time carrying messages during D-Day landings. Mary of Exeter survived multiple injuries, including being shot and attacked by hawks. Gustav brought first news of the D-Day landings. Simon the cat was the only feline recipient, awarded posthumously in 1949 for his service aboard HMS Amethyst during the Yanks incident, where he caught rats protecting food stores during 101 days of captivity. The official citation for G.I. Joe's Dickin Medal stated, "This bird is credited with making the most outstanding flight by a U.S. Army pigeon in World War II, making the 20-mile flight from British 10th Army HQ in the same number of minutes. It brought a message which arrived just in time to save the lives of at least 100 Allied soldiers from being bombed by their own planes." The citation is displayed at the U.S. Army Communications Electronics Museum alongside G.I. Joe's mounted remains. G.I. Joe lived at Fort Monmouth until March 1957, when the Army disbanded the Pigeon Service. Chief Signal Officer Major General James O'Connell ordered the disbanding at the end of 1956. The final date was March 23, 1957, when the Army sold its last homing pigeon after 40 years of service. The official reason was that widespread use of radio communications, conjunction with aircraft, made pigeon communication nearly obsolete. Advances in electronic warfare and 1950s communications technology meant the Army no longer needed biological backup systems. The ability to contact and supply isolated parties via radio and airplane eliminated the operational niche that pigeons had filled. Protests filtered in from all over the country and made their way to the Pentagon. Citizens cited unreliability of radios in combat and pigeons' exemplary records. Despite protests, deactivation proceeded. 15 hero pigeons were donated to zoos nationwide. G.I. Joe went to the Detroit Zoological Gardens, where he lived until June 3, 1961, dying of natural causes at age 18. Approximately 1,000 remaining birds were sold to the public at $5 per pair. The sale date was March 28, 1957. The Public Information Office received 1,500 requests for information. People came from all over the country, from as far as Canada and Mexico. Some stood in line for over 6 hours to purchase birds. Colonel Clifford Poutra, who had served as Chief Pigeoneer from 1936 to 1943, released the last Army pigeon at the close-out ceremony. Poutra retired in 1960 as commander of the Signal Corps Supply Agency at Tobyhanna, Pennsylvania, after 31 years of service. He died in April 2008 at age 103. After G.I. Joe died, he was taxidermied and displayed at the U.S. Army Communications Electronics Museum at Fort Monmouth. When Fort Monmouth closed in September 2011, G.I. Joe was transferred to the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center at Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania, where he remains on display. In 2019, G.I. Joe was posthumously awarded the Animals in War and Peace Medal of Bravery, adding to his recognition as one of the most decorated animal heroes of World War II. G.I. Joe's story is remarkable, But he wasn't the only pigeon saving lives in World War II. Dozens of other birds performed missions that prevented disasters or delivered critical intelligence. Understanding their stories puts G.I. Joe's achievement in context. Shows how widespread pigeon use was across all theaters of the war. Paddy flew missions on D-Day and recorded the fastest time carrying messages during the Normandy landing. The bird completed his flight from a landing craft to headquarters faster than any other pigeon that day, delivering crucial information about German defensive positions that allowed commanders to adjust their assault plans. Gustav also flew on D-Day, bringing the first news of the landings back to England. Both birds received Dickin medals for their service. Mary of Exeter was perhaps the most resilient pigeon of the entire war. She survived multiple injuries, including being shot, attacked by hawks, and hit by shrapnel on separate occasions. Mary completed missions while wounded, sometimes arriving at her loft barely alive but still carrying her message capsule. She received veterinary treatment after each injury, recovered, and returned to active service. After being hit by shrapnel that tore open her chest and neck, handlers gave her water and watched it dribble out through the wound. They stitched her up, and she survived. Mary of Exeter flew missions throughout the war and received her Dickin Medal in recognition of completing more combat missions while wounded than any other pigeon. Her determination became legendary among British pigeoneers. White Vision earned her Dickin Medal by flying 60 miles through heavy weather from a ditched aircraft in October 1943. The crew had crashed their bomber into the North Sea during a storm. Visibility was near zero. Waves were 15 to 20 feet high. The pigeon loft on the aircraft was damaged in the crash, but White Vision survived and took flight. She flew through driving rain and high winds, navigating without being able to see landmarks or use solar navigation. How she found her way home remains unclear, but she arrived at her loft exhausted and soaked. The message she carried gave search and rescue teams the location of the downed crew. They were recovered alive because White Vision completed an impossible flight through conditions that should have killed her. The meteorological officer at the squadron stated that no pigeon should have been able to fly in those weather conditions. White Vision did it anyway. Winky was the first pigeon to receive a Dickin Medal, awarded in December 1943. Her crew's Beaufort bomber ditched in the North Sea in February 1942, more than 100 miles from land. The crew survived the crash, but were stranded in a life raft, with no way to signal their position. Radio equipment was destroyed in the crash. Flares couldn't be seen from shore. Search and rescue didn't know where to look. Winky was released from the sinking aircraft and flew to her loft at RAF Leuchars in Scotland. She arrived covered in oil, exhausted, barely alive. The handlers calculated her flight time and direction, estimated the ditching position based on how long it took her to fly back, and passed coordinates to search and rescue. Aircraft spotted the life raft and recovered the crew. All survived because Winky delivered a message she wasn't even carrying. Her arrival, time, and condition were the message. The Burma theater saw extensive pigeon use in terrain where radios were almost useless. Dense jungle, high mountains, extreme weather, and vast distances created communication nightmares. Pigeon companies operating in Burma developed specialized training for jungle and mountain conditions. Birds learned to navigate through triple canopy rainforest where they couldn't see the ground. They flew at high altitude to clear mountain ranges that reached over 15,000 feet. Jungle Joe completed his 225-mile flight over the highest mountains in Burma, while carrying intelligence that opened Allied access to large sections of the country. The flight was considered impossible. Pigeons weren't supposed to be able to fly that far at that altitude in those conditions. Jungle Joe completed the mission at 4 months old, far younger than most combat pigeons. Other animals also served with distinction during World War II. Dogs performed multiple roles, including sentry duty, mine detection, messenger service, and casualty rescue. The most decorated war dog was Chips, a German Shepherd Collie Malamute mix who served with the 3rd Infantry Division in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, and Germany. On July 10, 1943, during the Sicily invasion, Chips broke free from his handler when his unit came under machine gun fire from an Italian pillbox. Chips attacked the machine gun nest single-handedly, forcing 4 Italian soldiers to surrender. Later that day, Chips helped capture 10 more Italian soldiers. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star, and Purple Heart. All 3 medals were later revoked because Army policy prevented official commendation of animals. Chips was posthumously awarded the PDSA Dickin Medal in January 2018 72 years after his death. Smokey was a Yorkshire Terrier discovered in a foxhole in New Guinea in February 1944. She weighed 4 pounds. Smokey accompanied her unit through 12 combat missions and survived 150 air raids. Her most notable achievement came when engineers needed to run telegraph wire through a 70-foot pipe under a crucial airstrip in the Philippines. Digging up the runway would have taken days and left the base vulnerable to air attack. Smokey pulled the wire through the pipe, completing the job in minutes and keeping the airstrip operational. She died February 21, 1957. And is memorialized with a statue at the Cleveland Metroparks in Ohio. Horses and mules remained essential despite World War II being the first fully mechanized war. Combined German and Soviet forces employed over 6 million horses during the war. Estimated casualties reached 1.75 to 2 million horses killed. The U.S. Army, though the most mechanized force in the war, still used thousands of mules in the China-Burma-India theater. Mules transported artillery, ammunition, food, medicine, and wounded soldiers through terrain completely inaccessible to trucks. Mountain trails in Burma and China were too narrow, steep, and unstable for vehicles. Mules could traverse terrain where jeeps couldn't go. They didn't need fuel, didn't need spare parts, and could subsist on local forage when supply lines were cut. Pigeoneers who served in Burma described watching mule trains carry supplies up mountains where one misstep meant a 1,000-foot fall. The mules were sure-footed, patient, and extraordinarily resilient. They saved countless lives by keeping remote outposts supplied when no other transportation method could reach them. The broader lesson from wartime animal service is that biological systems have capabilities that technology cannot always replicate. Pigeons navigated through conditions that defeated radio waves. Dogs detected mines and booby traps that metal detectors missed. Horses and mules transported cargo through terrain that destroyed vehicles. Each animal filled a niche where technology was insufficient or unavailable. Modern military forces have mostly eliminated animal use through technological advancement. Radios work reliably now. Vehicles can traverse almost any terrain. Mine detection equipment is sophisticated and effective, but in World War II, the technology wasn't there yet. Animals filled the gaps. They performed tasks that machines couldn't handle. They saved lives that technology couldn't save. Their service was essential to Allied victory. The 56th London Division continued fighting in Italy through the rest of 1943 and into 1944. They advanced through the Barbara Line, fought at Monte Cassino, participated in the battle. Around Monte Cassino, finally broke through the Gothic Line in late 1944. Brigadier Lewis Line was wounded at Monte Cassino on November 13, 1943, just weeks after the Calvi Vecchia action. He recovered and went on to even greater command responsibilities. In March 1944, Line was promoted to Major General and given command of the 59th Staffordshire Division. In November 1944, he took command of the 7th Armoured Division, the famous Desert Rats. It was unusual for an infantryman to command an armoured division, but Line's aggressive leadership style and tactical skill made him ideal for the role. In July 1945, he became commandant of the British sector in Berlin. Line retired in 1949 due to ill health. He died on November 4, 1970, at age 71. He was awarded the Companion of the Order of the Bath, Distinguished Service Order, mentioned in dispatches twice. Order of Kutuzov First Class from the Soviet Union, Legion of Honor from France, and Croix de Guerre from France. The village of Calvi Vecchia still exists as a small locality in the municipality of Calvi Risorta in the province of Caserta, Campania region, central Italy. Most current buildings date from after World War II. The village was damaged during October 1943 fighting even without the bombing. Artillery fire, small arms exchanges, and demolitions by retreating Germans caused significant destruction. The town was rebuilt in the late 1940s and 1950s. There's no memorial to G.I. Joe in Calvi Vecchia. Local residents know the story because historians have documented it, but there's no plaque or statue. The war is history now. The generation that lived through it is gone. The generation that rebuilt the town is mostly gone too. Current residents know their town was captured by British troops in October 1943. No, it was almost bombed by Americans. No, a pigeon prevented the bombing. But it's not something they think about daily. It's just a story from a long time ago. The lesson isn't that pigeons are better than radios. The lesson is that reliability matters more than sophistication. A simple system that works beats a complex system that fails. The SCR-300 backpack radio was a technological marvel in 1943. Frequency modulation, multiple channels, relatively portable, good range under ideal conditions. But the radios needed battery. That died after 40 hours of use. They needed spare tubes that burned out. They needed clear line of sight that mountainous terrain blocked. They worked brilliantly when conditions were perfect and failed completely when conditions weren't. G.I. Joe needed food, water, and a clean loft. That's it. No batteries, no spare parts, no technical maintenance. Release the bird and it flew home? Every time? Through artillery fire, through smoke, through weather. The reliability rate for military pigeons in World War II was over 90%. The reliability rate for SCR-300 radios in combat conditions was significantly lower. Dr. Frank Blazik at the Smithsonian Institution spent years researching U.S. Army pigeon operations. Blazik tracked down records, interviewed veterans, pieced together operation history that was at risk of being lost as the last pigeoneers died. He published papers, gave lectures, tried to preserve institutional knowledge. Blazik estimated that pigeons delivered over 90% of messages successfully in World War II combat conditions. That success rate was better than any other communication method available at the time. He estimated that the pigeon service probably saved thousands of lives over the course of the war, not just at Calvi Vecchia, but in hundreds of smaller incidents where a message got through when radios failed. A forward observer calling for fire support, a surrounded unit requesting evacuation, a reconnaissance patrol reporting enemy position. Every successful message delivery meant commanders could make better decisions, meant firepower arrived where it was needed, meant soldiers didn't die because of communication failures. Blazik also noted that the pigeon service was one of the most integrated units in the U.S. Army during World War II. Pigeon fanciers came from all backgrounds. The Army accepted anyone who knew how to handle birds. Black soldiers, white soldiers, Hispanic soldiers, immigrant soldiers. The pigeon service didn't care about race or ethnicity. If you could train a pigeon, you were valuable. That was unusual for the 1940s military. Most units were segregated by race, combat units were segregated, support units were segregated. The Army maintained separate facilities, separate commands, separate everything based on race. But the pigeon service was integrated by necessity. They needed skilled personnel, and there weren't enough white pigeon fanciers to fill all the positions, so they took whoever could do the job. That meant the pigeon service was quietly breaking down racial barriers years before the military officially integrated. Nobody made a big deal about it at the time. The pigeoneers just worked together because the birds needed care, and the mission needed to succeed. The total cost of the entire pigeon service for World War II was less than the development cost of a single new radio model. The Army spent millions developing advanced radio equipment. The SCR-300, the SCR-508, the SCR-609, dozens of other models. Sophisticated frequency, modulated radios that were supposed to solve all communication problems, and they helped. Radios transformed warfare by allowing real-time coordination of aircraft, armor, artillery, and infantry. But radios also failed constantly. When they failed, armies fell back on pigeons, birds that cost almost nothing to maintain, required no spare parts, needed no technical support. In combat conditions, the pigeons had a better success rate than the radios. That's how most innovation happens in war, not through cutting-edge technology or billion-dollar research programs, but through specialists who understand their tools and use them effectively when modern systems fail. G.I. Joe represented that principle perfectly. One bird, 12 ounces, flew 20 miles in 20 minutes and saved hundreds of lives because the bird was reliable and the radios were known.